I want to apologize before I start this. But I've been traumatized in the last 30 minutes 3 times by several different people. Cindy come in and accused me of being too long-winded in the class. Then Eric and Jay was figuring out signal, lay down and shut up. And then I was going to put this lapel mic on, and David and Tom just freaked out. I was afraid I wouldn't turn it off and you'd hear me singing over it. So, plus there's not supposed to be this many people here. I forgot about the visiting deal too. So we'll stumble. Then I broke my glasses, so I made all the excuses I can. So we'll start and try to see what we can come up with. And any time that you come to a service, whether it's be to or for our ultimate what? Salvation. For the idea that we are trying to get to heaven by the things that we study and learn and the things that we believe. As I told the class, when we did a discussion on part of the stuff that was in the Gospel of John, I told them they'd get a double dose of this, so we're going to do the same part of the same thing in here now. In addition of all good preachers, you get double duty out of whatever you can whenever you can do it. So the Gospel of John was written, generally considered, after the other Gospels, and does not contain as much of the story of Christ's life. It contains a lot of it, but a big part of the deal of the Gospel of John is generally considered by scholars as being a proof to the people that Christ was who he said he was. But in the class this morning of he came as a child, he lived a life up to the time that he died, just as you and I live. Set an example all the way through to us that we might follow that example, both in the things that he did by the reaction of the people that saw him and the things that we are taught by the things that he said and gave us, both through his own teachings and through the teachings of those that followed him, the apostles and other preachers and teachers. He came here to take away the sin of the world by offering himself and by sacrificing himself. Christ gave up a huge amount to come here and do that. And one of the things about Christ that we sometimes we're aware of it, but we do not pay the attention to it maybe that we should, is the fact that, and it's demonstrated several times, it's talked about in the Gospel of John and in other places, but it's demonstrated especially in John chapter 1 when we talk about Nathanael, and Christ, when Nathanael came to Christ, and Christ told him what he was thinking before he got there. Now, you may not consider that as being of very much significance, because you say, well, here this guy is, he's omniscient, he is God, he knows what's going on, he knows the things that are going on, but he was also human, demonstrated by John 11 when he said that Jesus wept, demonstrated by the fact that he was touched by the same emotions and feelings that we are today, just as you and I are today. He also, by the reaction of the people to him, when they called him just a carpenter's son or whatever, he worked right along beside all the other people that lived at that time, earned a living, did the things that he did. He didn't sin, but he was still exposed to everything that we are. So he lived a life that the result of, if you look at some of the ideas and the reason these people had to be convinced of him, the reason they wanted to sign, the reason that they had doubts about it was because here was a man. Their determination about him was that he was just another man, just like them. But some believed and some didn't. And when you consider the fact that all the things that are given to us are evidences of that. Now, when Christ made a defense of himself as being divine, as being of the Godhead, as being who he said he was, the Son of God, delivering a message from God, he had a defense that he used consistently in order to convince those people that he was who he said he was. He had already had there a phrase that he always used, not only Christ, but a lot of other people used. And we get further in the lesson, we'll discuss that phrase and the significance of it to us as well as it was to those people then. When he selected the apostles, there were others of those and the other people that he selected to follow him. The apostles came from a variety of walks of life. They were not all what would be considered elite of that time. They were considered commoners. In Acts 4, they are called unlearned, crude people. But you were people that were worked or whatever and earned a living. So the significance of that is the fact that just as Christ was a common type person in his life, these people were common type people. But the significance of the things that they knew when they taught from God, when they taught in a divine manner, in a manner that was significant to the people at that time as far as their salvation, then the contrast of where they were supposed to have come from with the message that they were delivering was in and of itself a confirmation of the fact that they were genuine in what they were saying. So that, along with lots of other things, is all the idea that, today we have a great tendency by a lot of people to consider the fact of religion as, I guess you would say, to be manipulated in some way. A big part of it in this day and time, especially the news media, manipulates our thinking. It manipulates a lot of people's thinking as far as religion and other things by the things that they report. By subtle ways that they say things that are maybe not incorrect, but are also not in exacting manner correct in themselves also. The thing about you have to do, the thing that one of the big deals of faith in Christ and the things that he taught is that the things that were given to us, were actually there. The teachings are actually there. They are actually comprehensible, and they were to serve a purpose in order that we may do the things that we should do. And this is what Christ used in his defense, the phrase that he used, that we'll talk about a little bit later. As I said, when Nathanael came and saw Christ, Christ told him what he had said in John 1, and he said, "Thou art the Christ." When Andrew and John, usually considered the two apostles or two disciples that are considered when they found Christ, first saw the fact that John the Baptist saw him and referred to Christ as, "Behold, the Son of God that taketh away the sin of the world." Then they immediately Andrew went to Peter, his brother, and told him, said, "We have found the Messiah." How did they know that? How did Nathanael, from the evidence is that when Christ told him what he was thinking, knew that this was the Christ, this was the genuine article? How did he know that? By the same phrase that Christ uses as his defense in the things that they accuse him of. When you go from Abraham to Rahab to Moses, all of these people use the evidences that were presented to them, both in a written manner and in an observational manner, of the things that were going on around them, that the genuine thing that was happening to them was the thing that should be happening. That this was actually from God. The things that were told to them were to be done by them. Now, granted, they were somewhat reluctant, some of them, in their carrying out of the things that they were told to do, but they still knew that this was God by the evidences that were presented to them. The evidences of that were demonstrated all the way throughout the Bible. And some of them said, before the belief that they had, when we talked about Abraham and Rahab and those, they believed, just as those people that were admonished to in the Gospel of John, and were demonstrated by the examples that John points out to them that Christ had performed for them. Now, these people all believed. They believed because they knew something, and they knew it for a reason, because it had been presented to them. And they had absorbed what had been taught to them and had taken that and, you might say, run with it, or whatever. The deal was in the teachings of Christ in John 7. When you get to John 7, this is after Christ has been accused of blasphemy, and that he did work on the Sabbath day. The work that he did was healing the man that was lame. And the rulers of the Jews jumped all over him for that. Here you are, you're blasphemous to God because you're doing the things that you shouldn't be doing. You're working on the Sabbath. Christ points out to them that they were doing the very thing by some of the actions that they were taking, specifically circumcision of his child on that same day, that they were doing works also on that. So they were wishy-washy in what their interpretation of the law was. It served the purpose for them to condemn somebody for whatever they wanted to be said done, then that was fine. But if they were in and of themselves doing the same thing, then it was all right. And we sometimes today have the tendency to do the same thing, sometimes to overanalyze. And all the teachings that go on when Christ fed the 5,000, when he was in the temple teaching and in other places teaching, when they brought the woman to him accused of adultery, he was sitting in a crowd teaching to them. And several different times through John and in other places, they say, and some believed. Some believed. They believed why? Because the evidences were there. Where were the evidences? The evidences were in the phrase that Christ used as his defense in the thing. The leaders in John 7, when he was accused of this blasphemous action that he had taken, the leaders, as is typical of leaders today, are people that are in a position to supposedly be leaders. They said, well, are you all, they accused Nicodemus, who was one of them, and, he said, does this man, do we judge this man according to this? Are we not being fair about our judgments in that? And they say, well, are you also of Galilee? Are you also one of them? None of the leaders, none of the big dogs believe this thing, so why do you? The point is there that the evidences were there and that always some people believed in what he was teaching. And they believed for a reason. And the reason is the same thing that Christ uses his defense of the things that he had done. We sometimes get hung up on the idea that we are being taught everything that we need to be taught. Therefore, our efforts are minimal on what? Our study, because we're being spoon-fed everything we need to be knowing. But people are described as being in and among you of teaching as wolves in sheep's clothing, of false teachers, false prophets that can be identified in some way. The way that they can be identified is in the same way that Christ uses his defense. We have to always be careful that the things that we are being taught, the things that we assume to be correct, are actually the correct things that they're saying. I don't know, and recently I was watching a show on the History Channel, I think, that was supposedly about the Apostle Paul. Somewhat about the Apostle Paul, but mostly it was about the city of Ephesus and the city of Cappadocia. Now, if you get a chance to see this show, it's I think very worth your time to watch for this reason. We have a tendency, and every generation has a tendency to say, well, we're smarter than the last generation. But this generation stands on the shoulders of the last generation. And the evidences that are presented to us have held consistently all through the time. God made it that way. He didn't shortchange us on anything that we should know. And we have a tendency to say, well, there's huge arguments. There's been volumes written about the books that are not included in the Testament, about the books that, you'll be in a discussion with somebody biblically and they'll say, well, what about the Maccabees? Or what about, recently it was the Gospel of Judas. Why aren't these things included? To me, your faith and belief in God should go to the extent that with your study and the background that you have in Scripture, as well as the things that you can study, that the Bible that we are presented with contains the things that we need to know. Now, at all times, as I said here, all the people, there was evidences there because you had people that believed every time Christ taught, every time Paul taught or anybody else, you had people that believed. Now, to the deal of Ephesus and Cappadocia. Ephesus, after the fall of Jerusalem, was the huge cultural center of that time. One of, if not the. And in Ephesus, in this documentary they pointed out, they contained the temple of Artemis. Now this was a structure that was built on swampy ground, which in and of itself requires some sort of engineering feat in order to maintain that thing in that type of environment, foundational environment. The rig was 400-something feet long by 200-something feet wide, 60 feet tall, with stone columns, with a roof on it and a huge idol in the middle of it of this goddess. This is one of the wonders of the world. There's not a bunch of yo-yos built this dude. They knew what they were doing. Would you agree? I mean, you couldn't be just, But our perception, the thing that is taught and pushed forward to us many times, is that these people were ignorant. Now, they were back there. We're here. We're in the information age. We're in the computer age. We're in an age when everything is given to us, that we have all this stuff presented to us. They didn't know all that stuff back then. They also had a theater there that seated some 25,000 people. One of the places where Paul was supposedly taught. Can you imagine? Here's a guy that is taught to this number of people. They also inferred in this show that the Apostle Paul, of course, Ephesus was a huge area of idol making. That was their economy was based a big part on that, and Paul wrecked that to a huge extent. He was responsible for the downfall of the city of Ephesus through his teachings and the people that believed that lived there. They also had in their houses from the excavations, they had an aqueduct system, had running water. They had a sewer system. They had a primitive type air conditioning system that utilized the water that was flowing to them as well as airflow in order to cool some of the houses. Now, granted that a lot of this was done with slave labor. They didn't have cranes and bulldozers and everything else, but the job was still accomplished. These people still were not what? The intellect level for the time was utilized to its fullest extent. In Cappadocia, the town was built on an area that was covered with volcanic ash to a depth of 300 feet, which was very easy to carve. So what you had was essentially you just carved you out a home out of this ash. When the situation came down to lots of persecution by the Christian people, they went below ground, built dwellings underneath the ground as well as worship facilities, everything else. They had air tunnels that went from where they were living below the surface to the surface as well as down to the water level below. Now, these people were not just a handful of people. They estimated at some point that 20,000 people lived down there. Down there with worship, but not hugely elaborate, but not just primitively common worship facilities. Now, those people at that time, as well as the people of Abraham's time, who, if according to Josephus, Abraham is credited somewhat with teaching the Egyptians mathematics and some other things. Intellect is utilized by standing on the shoulders of those that come before and expanding that with whatever you have available to you now. We're no smarter or no dumber than those that have come before us. Now, we're presented too often with the idea, scripturally, that the things that have been presented to us are only available to us in the last few years. Mostly because the first thing a lot of people bring up is that we have not had the availability of the written, printed word for long enough, and that these people back here were ignorant. That is incorrect. And why is it incorrect? There's an evidence that's taken throughout the Bible. If you get you a concordance and look under the word written, when you go back to Deuteronomy 6, what is the admonition there to the people of Israel? Write it on your hearts, on your mind. You say, well, that's passed on vocally or verbally. But he also said, write it on the posts of your houses and write it other places. And when you go to the law of Moses, it was what? Written. Now, if it's written, and then the next argument that's used is, well, these people were too dumb to read it. Now, granted, some of them may have been illiterate, but why would God have given something and say, write it down, prepare it for those that are both present here and to come afterward, and it not be available to everybody to have? Because this thing is not to an elite group, it's given to the whole mankind. Christ, in his defense, and we go back to John, in his defense, what he used was, when Nicodemus came to him, Nicodemus was a leader, and he, came to Christ because he believed in him, and Christ admonished him. He said, you're a leader of the Jews. You should know that I am who I say I am. But his admonition was, it is written. That's the phrase. It is written. If these people were too dumb or too whatever to not be able to have the printed word there or whatever, to not have it written down, to not have it available to them, why would Christ use that as his defense? We are no better or no worse, no smarter or no dumber than those people then. It has always been written. It has always been available. Now, it might not be as available as it is today, but it was still available to those people at that time. That is the defense that Christ uses. That is the defense that all people are using, that you must take into consideration if you're sitting here today. When we talked about the rich man and Lazarus there, your salvation is dependent upon what is written, not on the excuses that you can come up with, not on the reasoning that you can say, well, I'm too old, or I'm too young, or I'm too whatever to know what this is. And it wasn't available to us then, so therefore I'm not responsible. It's always made available, everything that was necessary to be available to you to confirm your salvation in whatever period of time you were in. All you had to do was take advantage of the availability of that and apply it to what you needed to know. Now, when Christ said it is written, how does that apply to us today? It is applied to everybody in the past because that's the defense that he uses. It is written applies to us today for this reason. You've been told, and I've been told. It's written here in the words that we use in these Bibles that we carry. It's written there for us to learn from the time that we are old enough to be accountable for what we do. If you know what you're doing is right or wrong, if you are capable of making the determination of what is right or wrong, that God is God and that he needs to be recognized as such, that Christ came to this world and did the things that he should, then you are old enough to do the things, to abide by the things that are written. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the most significant thing about that, and too often we have a tendency to listen to people and to discuss things. For instance, in John, where Christ was writing on the ground when the woman in John 7 making an adultery to him, and he bent over and rolled on the ground. I've heard people preach sermons and discuss this and talk about what was he writing on the ground. It doesn't make any difference. It's of no significance. It is unanswerable. And by discussing that as well as another one, baptism, for instance. In Acts 2:38, at the day of Pentecost, the people were told to what? Repent and be baptized. It is generally accepted by everyone, I guess, for whoever or whatever religious belief, that baptism is immersion. At least at that time was considered immersion by everyone. But we too often have, by looking for the easier or the more convenient, we eliminate what is obvious and what has been told to us. Now, the thing was written, it was told to us that we should do baptism in a certain way. The things that are unanswerable, leave them unanswerable. Don't discuss them as being hugely significant, because if they're unanswerable, God left them that way. Christ left them that way. The teachers that were people that were writing the Bible left them that way. And by over-discussing the unanswerable, you diminish the significance of that is significant. The significance of the significant. At some point, leave me alone, Tom. At some point, the significant part of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. If you're in this audience, like I say, if you're old enough to understand and know, if you're old enough to read what is written, to apply the things and understand those things to your life, then you've been told. And the most important part, not the most important, but one of the most significant parts about the story of the rich man and Lazarus is when the rich man is standing there looking across and he says, you know, there's Lazarus over there and I'm over here and I wish that I was over there. And he's told that there's a gulf fixed, a place fixed here. Just like this is forever deep and forever wide, that it's impossible for me to pass from here to there, someone over there to pass from there to here. Now, if you take away the darkness, the things that are significant about an existence in hell, all the things that are hammered on as being bad, as being things that you don't want to happen to you. To me, the most significant thing that happens there, the most wrenching thing to your psyche, the thing that will absolutely torment you most if you do not make it, if you do not abide by the things that are written, the things that are put there for you to understand, the things that are put there for you to obey, is the fact that you're standing here on this side, looking across at that side. Take everything else away. And the very fact that on October 8th, 2006, and as well as several times in the past, I had the opportunity to do what's right. I had the perception, the intellect, the opportunity, and the place to do what was right, to establish a confirmation of my salvation both today and forever. And I stand there in eternity, on this side looking across, and forget all the bad things about it. Standing there looking across, or sitting there, whatever your existence is enough to torment you to death. Take all the bad away. If you're responsible, you're responsible. If you're responsible, do something about it. Study, apply it, do the things that you know to do. Take what is written. Take the defense that Christ used as his defense. It is written. It is written. You've been told. It is provided for you there. It's available to you. It should be taken and studied. When Nat preached on the Philip and the eunuch was seeking something there. He knew he should do something. Philip provided the teaching. If you don't understand something, find someone that can explain it. If you do not have access to the things that you need, find someone to give it to you. But study it. It's not that complicated. When Christ said in Matthew 5 that my yoke is easy and my burden is light, he wasn't lying to you. Don't be persuaded that the things that are there are too complicated to understand. That an extensive commentary is necessary for salvation. It is not. An easy yoke, a light burden, is what he provided. What we provide is obedience there too. You have no excuses. You've been told and I've been told. If you're subject, if you understand, if you know what you should do, then do it as we stand and sing.